This is Brent with Lykins Motorsports. Getting ready to do part 2 of this build with this 496 cubic inch FE. Last week I did part 1 where we went over some details of the BBM block that we're going to use. I did neglect to mention a couple of things that I wanted to point out before we began this time. And I've got the camshaft in here, but it's may be a little harder to see. But if you guys are doing these at home and you're knocking in cam bearings, the cam bearings are a lot wider than normal FE bearings, and they have a tendency to overlap the lifter bore. So when you're knocking in the cam bearings, just make sure that you can put a lifter in after you do it. So like I said, it's really hard to see, but this one right here is a culprit, and this one on the number 2 journal will be a culprit. You can see how the cam bearing, or I'm sorry, the lifter bore can get into that cam bearing bore right there. So if you knock the bearings in too far, you can make it a whole lot harder on yourself later when you're trying to put the lifters in and you find out that they won't bottom out. One more thing that I wanted to show was these BBM blocks are just very, very nice. They already come with this passage tapped, and this is generally a place where you can restrict the oil to the heads or block it off completely, and they go ahead and tap it for you. I generally don't like to tap it or restrict it right there, just for the fact that if you ever wish to change it, then you're looking at having to pull the heads to make it change. So I generally like to restrict in the cylinder head itself. All right, so I'm gonna flip this back over and reposition my camera, and we're gonna get the crankshaft in this block. And if you remember, last week I said that I had to have the crank polished a little bit to get me some, get the clearance back on this number 2 main journal. So that's done, I've checked that, and we're ready to proceed. All right, so we got our crankshaft in here. This is a forged steel 4 1/4 stroke scat crank. What I like to do before going any further, I don't even have any oil on the bearings right now. I want to check that upper thrust bearing. These are doweled caps, so I won't be able to set the thrust bearing or set the thrust bearing cap like you normally would. So I want to go ahead and check this upper bearing, so if it needs any adjustment, I can take the crank back out and do that. Got my dial indicator and mag base on the crank snout, and got it on 0 there, and we're just going to push the crank. Got about 4.5 thousandths there. And the general idea here is when you can move the crank back and forth in the block. When you pry, you don't want to continually pry. My goal is to move it, and then when I let off the screwdriver, the clearance that I have is what it should be. So we're sitting at 5 thousandths there. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can take my screwdriver and I can push, and I can make this thing do a whole lot more just by, flexing or deflecting the bearings or the crank. So when you let off your screwdriver, that's the clearance that you have. So we're looking at 5 thousandths there on the upper bearing shell, and I'm gonna pull the crank out now and get some lube on the seal and the bearings and get this thing started back in. All right, so we got our crankshaft in the block. Before we did that, I went through all the bearing shells and made sure that Everything was oriented correctly there, that all the upper bearing shells were in the right spot. The rear main seal is facing the right way. I put lubricant on the bearings, put lubricant on the rear main seal. Since these caps are doweled, when you go to set the thrust bearing, you won't do much good there. So what I usually do on these blocks is I check the thrust clearance with the caps off, and I had 5 thousandths there with the caps off. In the event that I didn't have the correct amount of in play, then it would have been necessary to remove the crank and put the thrust bearing on a very flat piece of steel or marble or something like that, and sand the surface of it to get the correct clearance. And then when you drop the crank in and you get the thrust bearing cap on, then you check it again. So I had 5 thousandths both times, so we didn't have to touch that. It's very common to have to do that though, so that's something to look out for. This is a Scat 4340 crankshaft, 4 1/4 stroke. Real nice piece. Love these things. Scat is pretty much all that I use for my FE builds. So we got the crank in there. Mains torqued to 110 pound-feet, and the ARP side bolts torqued to 65, and I usually put a little bit of silicone in between the block and the washer just to eliminate the possibility of any leaks there. Got our coils, billet timing set, and I have the cams ground with the amount of advance or retard that I want in them, and I usually just go ahead and put the crank gear on in the neutral position there, no advance or no retard, and the timing set it's on there. This is a billet timing set, double roller, and we've checked our dowel pin length, and we've checked our ARP cam bolt length. All of that needs to be checked. So I'm going to pause the camera now and get everything set up. We're going to degree this cam in, and that'll be the next step. One thing I did want to point out, I don't use the side seals and the nails anymore. I haven't done that in several years. I got to the point where I just got fed up with having to, each block is different, and then you're set, you know, sitting down with some sandpaper or a razor blade and trying to trim those side seals. It's just a very antiquated process. I use Dow Corning 732 silicone. It's FE proof, and I just shoot those cavities full of silicone until it squirts out the back, and I'll come back and trim that off later. But there's no way that this thing could leak, and I've had really good success out of that. I'm sure I just shot myself in the foot, and this one will leak, but this is a pretty common practice here. Saves a lot of time. Okay, so we got our piston and rod assembly in on number 1. That'll be the cylinder that we use to degree the camshaft off of. You can actually degree the cam off of any cylinder as long as you follow the correct procedures for doing that. You have to find top dead center and just orient yourself to that particular cylinder. On race engines, it's not uncommon to degree on several different cylinders just to get an idea of what the camshaft is doing. So the first thing, and everybody, I guess, does their thing a different way, but I use the intake centerline method the majority of the time, but I also check some 50 thousandths events while I'm rolling through, just to make sure that everything's kosher with that. There are some underlying things that have to be done. The first is that you have to have the cylinder that you're working on, it has to be at top dead center, and you have to orient your degree wheel at perfectly top dead center. So I've already went and brought this one up with a dial indicator and a cylinder bridge to get close. And what I'm going to do now is use a piston stop and just verify that everything's right. So I'm going to roll this piston down, and we have our piston stop. This is a piston stop that I have made. If you have looked around, you will notice that most of piston stops are made for Chevrolet motors, and they will not span from bolt hole to bolt hole on a Ford. Let me grab another wrench here. So I have these made. They're anodized aluminum, and they'll even work with a 385 series engine that has 9/16 bolt holes. So what we're going to do, we're going to bring the piston up against the stop. We're going to do it gently. We have to adjust our stop. And I had a solid hit there. And if you notice, we are at 14 degrees there. Now I'm going to go all the way back around. And I'm on the stop there. And I'm at about 15.5 there. So I'm going to just make a little bit of a change on my degree wheel. I'm going to check it again. I'm going to go backwards. And I should be right about 14.5. And that's where I am, 14.5. I'm going to check it one more time. I'm going to go back the other direction. If you're not at correct TDC on the wheel, then everything else will be skewed. So we've established that. I'm going to take my piston stop off. Now the front lifter on an FE is exhaust. The second one is the intake. We're going to check the intake one first, but that lifter has to be on the heel of the cam lobe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll the engine over until I see the exhaust valve start to open, and then I know that the intake valve is going to be closed. The lifter is going to be on the heel of the lobe, so that lifter is coming up. Then I want to set my dial indicator. Looking for my pin light. So another mistake a lot of guys make is that the dial indicator plunger is not on the center of the lobe. I'm sorry, the center of the lifter push rod cup. And then you want to make sure that you have enough travel for the lobe lift of your cam. So I'm going to roll this to 0 because we're on the heel of the lobe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this over until I see max lift, and I'm going to count the number of revolutions on the dial indicator so I can check my intake lobe lift at the same time. So there's 100 thousandths, 200 thousandths, 300 thousandths, 350, 360, and we stopped at 361. So if we look at our cam card, we are at 361 thousandths lobe lift. So our lift is on spec. Now this, while we're doing the intake center line method, what you're doing is you're basically finding the very peak of the lobe and comparing that to the intake center line that's on the cam card. So this cam is on a 114 lobe separation, and I specified it to be on a 106 intake center line. So the intake center line is hard to find. You can't just come up on the top of it. So what we have to do is we get basically on 100 thousandths of each side of the peak of the lobe, and then we can do some simple math and we can find the intake center line and compare it to the cam card. So we are at peak lift on the cam. I'm gonna zero my dial indicator one more time. And I'm gonna go backwards 100 thousandths. That's just to get all the slack out of the timing chain. And I'm gonna go in normal engine rotation direction, and I wanna stop at 50 thousandths. So, and we're gonna look at our degree wheel. We are at 61 and a half, okay? And I'm gonna keep on going in normal engine rotation direction, and we should hit 0 and then start to come back. And we're gonna stop at 50. So we're getting 2 points, one at 50 thousandths on one side of that intake lobe, and one at 50 thousandths on the other side of the intake lobe. And this one is 148 and a half. So we're gonna get our calculator. 61.5 and what did I say? 148.5. We're gonna average those two. So we are on a 105 intake center line. Pretty stinking close to 106, and I can change. This is a really good timing set. If you can see, it's got about 9 different keyways in it. I can't get to 1 degree increments though, so we're going to leave it at that. I really like advanced cam timing on street engines, and gives a lot of throttle response down low, some really good street manners. So I'm gonna leave this exactly where it is. Okay, we're gonna do our exhaust side. We got our exhaust lifter on the heel of the lobe, and we've zeroed our dial indicator. So I'm gonna roll this engine over, and we're gonna check lobe lift. There's 200 thousandths, 300 thousandths. And we're stopping at about 350 and a half. So we're gonna look at our cam card. Spec is 351. So 350 and a half is pretty stinking close. We're going to zero our indicator there. And we should be right at the top of the exhaust lobe. We're gonna go 50 thousandths on each side, and we're gonna average those numbers, just like we did on the intake side. So I'm gonna back up, and I go 100, so that when I change direction, it takes the slack out of the timing chain. And then we're gonna go forward again to 50. Okay, And we've got 171 on our degree wheel. We're going to keep going forward. We should hit 0. And we do, and then we're going to go backwards because we were on the peak of the lobe and now we're going down. And we're going to stop at 50 and 75. So 75 plus 171 is 123. We're going to take 123. We're going to add it to our intake center line, which is 105. And we're going to divide that by 2. And what you get is your lobe separation. So, got a 114 lobe separation, 114. That's how you degree a camshaft. We checked the intake center line, and we checked the exhaust center line, and the average of the intake center line and the exhaust center line is your lobe separation angle. Okay, if you're wondering how to do the valve event method instead of the intake center line method, if you notice your cam card will have the valve timing at 50 thousandths. Intake opens 17 degrees before top dead center at 50 thousandths. And then close 49 degrees after bottom dead center, and your exhaust opens at 68 degrees before bottom dead center and closes at 4 degrees after top dead center. So this is really easy to check. You can do it this way too. I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. We want to, since we're still on the exhaust lifter, we're going to roll that thing over until we see the intake go up and go down and start to go down. And then we know that our exhaust lifter is on the heel of the cam lobe for sure. I'm going to 0 my dial indicator. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to 50 thousandths. So 50 thousandths off of the heel of the lobe. Just nice and easy. Stop. So we are at 69 and a half, thereabouts. So our exhaust opening at 50 thousandths is 68. So instead of opening 68 degrees before bottom dead center, we're opening at like 69 and a half before bottom dead center. So we are opening that exhaust valve about a degree and a half earlier than what we had planned on the cam card. Again, a degree and a half is something that I can't tune out with the timing set. So we're going to leave that alone. That's well within a tight tolerance there. So cam's degreed, and we're going to knock some pistons in next. All right, so I'm going to knock one piston in on camera, and I'll spare you for the other 6. But this is very important here. I use these DuPont lint-free wipes, and you just want to go through your cylinders and make sure that they're very clean. Before you do this, you should be able to scrub and wipe and not see anything at all on the towel. Okay, we're moving on. This is our number 4 piston rod assembly. Got some oil on the cylinder. We need some oil, just a light coat on the rings and on the skirts. I'll smooth that around. Put some oil in the bearing. Got our crank at bottom dead cylinder. All there is to it. Okay, we're going to go through and torque our rod bolts. Most of your higher end rods do not use a torque spec. You either stretch them or you do a torque plus angle. That's what we're going to do with these. These torque at 30 pound-feet plus 60 degrees. You use a digital torque wrench like this one, and it keeps track of the torque, and then it keeps track of the angle. So we're going to go through and torque a couple of our rod bolts. I'm switching to angle, and I'm going to grab a different view here. And it also vibrates when we get to the specified torque. And that's all there is to it. And we're going to go through and do the rest of them. Now we're going to go through and check our side-to-side clearance. Sitting at about 21 thousandths on these. This is just a good check, just to make sure that well, you don't have excessive or too tight, and that all of the it's a double check for yourself to make sure that no rod caps are backwards or anything like that. This is very hard to do one-handed, guys. Alright, finally got that one in there. A little bit of drag on 21 thousandths. So all of our rod side clearances are 21 thousandths. Okay, it's going to finish it up for part 2. I think I'm going to call it quits right here for now. I went back and retorqued everything just to check, double check myself, and then I usually put a dab of paint on the fastener head, just to know that I've been back over it and it's been checked, even down to the cam bolt and the thrust plate bolts. So we have a complete short block assembly, and part 3 will probably be bolting on the timing cover and cylinder heads and doing some other work. So once again, hit the like button, subscribe, tell your friends, and have a good day.